appreciation for nature, which is hosted by Umazi, who is rather one of the We Are Family Foundation COP28 youth delegates. So that's going to be very immersive, very experiential. And if that's your vibe and you want to head over there, you can more than happy to have you do that. But if you're staying here, I'm so happy for this panel to really bring us back to how can we ensure that during these climate conversation, we're ensuring that we are restoring our relationship, because nature is very personal, nature is alive just as much as we are, as we heard earlier from Umazi. I am Andy, and I have had the incredible honor of hosting all day today, and I'm so glad to have done it. I just have to dash over to a panel in the Blue Zone in just a little bit, so this is the last you're seeing of me, but it's been an immense pleasure. I'm so grateful to We Are Family Foundation, to Natural History Museum, to Extreme Hangout for this opportunity. It's been great, and I hope you continue to enjoy. There's more to come and more exciting things, restoring our relationship with nature. Mitzi, Rachel, and Richard, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mitzi. I am a full-time climate justice activist from the Philippines, and I'm also part of the Natural History Museum of London's Youth Advisory Board on their Generation Hope project, which has really changed the way that I view nature and how I view biodiversity and how my relationship with it. So I'm really excited to have two such amazing panelists with me. To my left, I have Richard Sabin, who is the curator of marine mammals at the Natural History Museum of London, and then Rachel Parent, the founder of Kids Right to Know. So to start off, I wanted to ask you both to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you've been doing.
You'll start off?
After you.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Rachel Parent. I'm the founder of an organization called Kids Right to Know. I started at the age of 12 when I found out about our food systems, and particularly when I found out about GMOs, pesticides, and herbicides, I became really concerned about the fact that we really don't know what we are eating. We don't know what we're contributing to on an environmental level. And I wanted to educate other kids like myself about what we can do. And so that was the start of Kids Right to Know. And it has been an incredible journey. I'm really lucky that I've had so many amazing opportunities along the way. We've worked with youth all around the world. We've worked with campaigns that are cross-generational. And it's really been an honor to say that I've been able to reconnect with the earth through the work that I do. For me, it started simply as planting a seed in elementary school, and I think that really brought out my love for nature. And so now we run a community garden actually to give other young people the exact same experience that I was able to have and have the privilege to have, so that they can reconnect with earth, with nature, put their hands in the soil, and feel like we really are one. We have the ability to make a change in this world.
Thank you, Rachel. I really wanted to focus on what she said around access to information and access to nature at a young age, and we'll circle back around that after. But Richard, please introduce yourself and the work you've been doing.
Thank you, yeah. So I'm Richard Sabin. I'm not curator of principles, which is what the title actually says. Everybody does it, don't worry about it. I'm a principal curator at the Natural History Museum, and I study marine mammals, and we have one of the best marine mammal research collections in the world. I do a lot of work with animals that have been dead for a very long time, and that might seem kind of counterintuitive, but one of the things that I'd like to try and do today is actually contextualize those collections and talk about the importance of the material and the things that I've been able to develop in the time that I've been at the museum, 30 years, more than 30 years. The techniques which have been developed to extract information from the bones of these animals that have lived over the past 2-3 centuries. They're actually informing us about how the earth has changed, how the oceans have changed, the kind of stresses the animals have been under from museum collections. So I'm very passionate about access, making sure that the barriers that people might perceive national collections have, excluding people. As far as I'm concerned, there are no barriers. You know, the title is national collection. It means the collection is for the nation. It should be accessible to everyone. I'm all about that and have been for a very long time. I'm very, very passionate about the oceans, about marine ecosystems, and bringing knowledge to people about what's going on in the oceans with these incredible animals, the whales, dolphins, and porpoises, and how significant and important they are to ecosystems and for biodiversity generally.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for the work that you're doing to ensure that that access is something that people can tap into. Rachel, I'd like to ask you now, and you already touched on this a little bit about how you started at such a young age, but how did your personal relationship to nature develop, and how did you end up where you are now?
I think I was very lucky from the beginning. My mom was vegetarian. My grandmother was vegetarian. So I'm like third generation in all of this space of understanding food. I do remember having a really strong connection with food systems, even from a young age. Being raised vegetarian and not eating meat, I wanted to know where meat came from. And I remember researching slaughterhouses when I was about 7 years old and seeing what pigs specifically went through, and was really, really saddened by that. My mom always gave me the option to not be vegetarian, and that sort of solidified my need to care for animals and to have empathy for animals, but also people. It's all encompassing for life. And then I think around that age as well, I went to a really small school, and our teacher encouraged us to plant sunflower seeds. And the magic of watching a seed take root and starting to see it sprout and becoming a life of its own is really something that excited me. And all of that played in many years later. I forgot my connection to Earth. I forgot everything. I went to high school. I became like the average person that doesn't necessarily have a connection with nature. And that really changed as I started to be more involved in the food system, and what woke me up more and more was just how deeply interconnected our food is with pretty much every other major issue that you can think of. The cutting down of our rainforest to grow genetically modified soy and spray Roundup all throughout these sensitive areas, the algae blooms in our water bodies that are related to fossil fuel fertilizers. I mean, when you really start to look at how interconnected everything is within our food system, it creates a really big story. And that's sort of when I realized that I needed to connect with nature and put my hands in the soil, and I started gardening many years ago now. And a couple years ago, the city granted us land to have this community garden. And this past year was our first big pilot project where we could release it to the public and have young people come out. And in our first year, we had about 70 young people. And beyond watching my relationship with nature strengthen, I also watched a group of 70 young people transform in their own ways and bloom as the garden was blooming, and really just see how they started to care for one another in connection with the earth as well, and it was really special.
Thank you, Rachel. That, again, you keep coming back to access, to community initiatives, for young people to have spaces to even be able to have these experiences, I think is so crucial and important. And that actually does play quite smoothly into your story, I believe, Richard. So how did your personal relationship to nature develop, and how did you end up where you are now?
Yeah. So I'm typical, I think, of a lot of people that have grown up in very built-up areas, very big cities. So I'm from a great city, a bankrupt city in the UK called Birmingham, and didn't really have an awful lot of access to anything green, particularly as a child. But I remember one really kind of formative experience when I was about 4 or 5 years old. It was just before I went to school, and I went round to see my granddad, and he was planting potato peelings and carrot tops in his garden and growing his own vegetables. And it was the first time that I became aware of that whole process of, you know, you can actually take your food waste and turn it into something new, grow your own food, become aware of the whole process of growth and seasonality. And obviously, as a child, it amazed me at a very kind of basic level, but it made me start to think as I went through my early years about food, about where it came from. And it made me really passionate about making sure that we were eating things that were grown locally and things that were kind of fresh. And everybody back then had little vegetable patches and allotments if they didn't have a garden. That's one side of things, but the journey to where I am today is a little bit darker. And I'll tell you the story, and I apologise in advance if this offends anyone. But, so, I had always had a passion for bones, for skeletons, and trying to understand, I wanted to understand more about animals, but what was on the inside, how they were, the animals they were on the outside because of the bones that were in them. So I had to get my hands on some bones. Quick tip, you live in a city, head to the edge of the city, there's bound to be a road somewhere between the grey space and the green space, and unfortunately, it tends to be littered with roadkill. So get yourself a bike with a basket on the back. When nobody's looking, collect the roadkill. Now, that will take you in one of two directions. I always have to say this just to kind of qualify things. You'll either become a serial killer, or potentially you'll become a National Museum curator, which is what happened to me. But what it meant was I started collecting the semi-flattened remains of these animals that I was finding, taking them home, had a very understanding father, gave me a little patch of ground, buried them. By the time I was 14, I had a reference collection. And it was that reference collection that fascinated me. It taught me an awful lot. I digested as much as possible that was available to me through the local library. Not an awful lot going on with the school. You know, I was at school in the 70s, left school in the early 80s. Not an awful lot of support outside of very kind of near horizons for the kids, expecting a lot of the kids to go into, and actually actively encouraging a lot of the kids to go into industry, factories and so on, which, of course, at that point in time, were all starting to close down. If you had any interests, passions that you wanted to pursue outside of what was directly available in the school, there was nothing. There was no way to sort of support that. So it was an incredibly frustrating time, and it didn't mean that I went out and collected more roadkill. By that point, I had basically every flattened British mammal, apart from the really big ones, in my own collection. But it was a realization for me that in order to escape the pressures of my family and actually pursue this interest that I had to leave everything behind. That was the only way that I could really deal with the way things were going. And so by the time I was 17, I was gone, left the city behind, started working in the countryside with people in nature, learning about nature, learning about the kind of things that supported me in my development into this career. So very circuitous, incredibly circuitous. So a bit of an odd relationship with nature, but nonetheless a relationship.
Thank you, Richard. It's interesting for me to see how for both of them, they both had that relationship in very different ways at a very young age, and how that access is so crucial. So for Rachel, it was in school, and for Richard, it was outside of school. My experience is more similar to, well, not similar to Richard's in the way that I collected dead animals, but I didn't have access to that sort of education and more on-ground practical experience with nature. So my country, if you do have the privilege to have education, the way that biodiversity, the way that the climate crisis is explained is very scientific and technical and Western and foreign. So not at all contextualized to our experience, to our nature, despite the Philippines being one of the most beautiful and biodiverse countries in the world, especially for ocean systems. We didn't get to learn any of that. So my relationship to nature came because I saw destruction. So I grew up with these huge trees, and then I also at the same age of 7 or 9 or something, I came out after the typhoons, and the huge trees that I grew up with were on the ground, and I started crying. I don't remember this actually. My parents tell me this story, and they said, "Why are you crying, Mitzi?" And I'm like, "The earth is hurt. Something is wrong." But you know, the way that the educational system happens, just like you, Rachel, you forget about this. You know, you go into high school, you go into university even sometimes, and they're telling you to, just as you said, the way that they're taught, the way that they teach you is not to teach you to go into these conservation-related jobs or industries, but really to talk more about the technical industries, all these things. And so inherently, our relationship to nature is removed from us. at a very young age. Like as kids, we all like to play outside, and then we're put into classrooms and then separated. And then the access to nature that we will usually have are curated nature. If you have green spaces, they're usually parks. That's not wild. It's very clean, it's very chosen, it's very beautiful. It's not what nature truly is. And then there also comes the conversation of what else is part of nature. Humans are often removed from the conversation. And that is how I'm going to transition to my next question of what are the issues around biodiversity that you both are working on, and what do you think still needs to be done?
Go first?
No, after you.
Once again. So I started on food systems issues, and I was mentioning how deeply interconnected our food is with so many of the other issues that we see. When it comes to our Amazon, there's a huge problem right now with the introduction of genetically engineered trees, and that has implications for contaminating and really impacting all of our forests yet to come. Brazil's Cerrado forest and terrestrial land is one of the most at-risk spaces right now, and it actually is 5% of diversity of species, and it's held all in this one area of Brazil, and yet through carbon offsets, which is a controversial topic in a place like COP, people are paying carbon offsets to plant trees somewhere in the world, and they don't oftentimes know where it's headed. And in reality, it's generally ending up in indigenous people's lands, and they are being displaced as a result. So genetically engineered trees are now ending up in the Cerrado terrestrial space. It's a savanna and forested area as well as wetlands, which all three of those are some of the greatest carbon sinks that we have at our disposal. And they're being destroyed to create monocultures of genetically engineered trees that are being sprayed with Roundup, which is one of the most pervasive and destructive herbicides on this planet. And so we need to start really thinking deeper about our connection to nature, and it sounds good to buy offsets and be a part of the solution, but what does that solution really look like? And is it holistic? And is it working really with the land, or is it working with corporations' profits and their pockets? And I'd like to be a part of the real solutions that are on the ground. For us, pollinators were a huge part of creating solutions. So let's create pollinator spaces, and let's teach kids about pollinating and what pollinators are. A huge part of it too was teaching about these sensitive areas in the Amazon that are being destroyed. And we worked on cross-campaign issues to remove some of the really toxic pesticides and herbicides in our food systems that are really impacting every single level of our lives. For instance, neonicotinoids and herbicides like glyphosate, as I mentioned, are killing off our pollinators in drastic levels. And without pollinators, we do not have food. 1 in 3 bites of food is pollinated by a bee. And so if you don't have bees, if you don't have pollinators, you do not have anything to eat. And that's where the climate change topic becomes a lot more niche, because I feel like we say climate change a lot, but we don't look at the very small intersections that actually impact biodiversity and different areas within that biodiverse biome that we have that are contributing to the climate crisis. When we're cutting down our rainforests, we are releasing emissions. When we are having factory farms, it's releasing methane. And we need to start looking at those niche areas and taking action on them individually, and that's how we can really restore nature relationships within each of these industries.
That's really interesting that you take note of that, where it is true, like a lot of times, not just world leaders, but we even have the fault of seeing climate change as just the emissions, just the fossil fuels, but not looking at the biodiversity aspect of it. And something that really terrifies me is that as we more and more push into renewable energy, the mining industry for those minerals for renewable energies, what does that mean for our biodiversity, for our indigenous peoples who live on that land? And so that's a conversation that we have to be having at the same time. But it's difficult to have these conversations because they're such huge topics and there's such large aspects, and a lot of negotiators or governments will say, oh, that's not climate change anymore, that's biodiversity. I'm like, okay, but what are we actually fighting for? Is it just, are we fighting for emissions, or are we fighting for life? And so that, I have the same question for you, Richard, so feel free to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've always found it kind of frustrating and also quite fascinating that there's such a divide put between climate change and biodiversity, and yet they're so intricately linked. You know, good biodiversity in an area equals healthy ecosystems, and those healthy ecosystems do so much to stabilize climate and help with climate change. So for me, from my perspective, being able to work with the research collections at the Natural History Museum it's a joy. It's been an absolute joy. I've been there, like I say, for just over 30 years. And one of the things that I was fortunate enough to do was get a job working with marine mammals, working with the largest animals on the planet, and using the reference collections that we have, specimens that were collected over centuries from different parts of the oceans, from places now where those animals don't exist anymore because of commercial whaling, factory whaling at the start of the 20th century. And this again might sound counterintuitive, but I wanted to sort of contextualize the value of these collections because back in 1999, our museum was given a donation of about 6,500 teeth from sperm whales that were taken during British whaling activities from about 1947 to roughly about 1960. And those teeth, those 6,500 teeth, represent roughly 2,000 sperm whales, individual sperm whales. The teeth were being taken from the animals at the time by the whalers, by the scientists working for the whaling factories, to try and understand the ages of the animals that they were killing. And so some of the teeth were half-sectioned, and within these teeth you can see the growth layers, and there was an age determination made on those. When that collection came to our museum in 1999, I saw it then as an opportunity to do several things, one of which was investigate the loss of genetic diversity from these populations of sperm whales over this period of time from quite a broad range across the South Atlantic, and look at what we'd lost. And one of the things that you may have heard over the past couple of decades that's been a real focus for bodies like the International Whaling Commission is trying to reconstruct pre-whaling population sizes to understand the scale of the loss. Genetically, there are ways that you can do that. But the other thing that has been absolutely fascinating for me, and again, it's a little bit like science fiction, the value of this material. The way that we work with the specimens now is completely unlike the way that we would have worked with them 30 years ago because of the techniques that are available to us. So inside those teeth, as well as information about the genetics and the haplotypes, the unique haplotypes that have been lost, there's information about diet, there are hormones in there, there's information about migration, movements, a whole range of things. So we have an opportunity to create a data set and generate evidence. And of course, for us at the museum, it's all about evidence. And of course, when you have evidence, it's pretty hard to argue with that. So a body of evidence that we can use to help inform the debate about what happened in the past, what we need to do in the future, setting up marine protected areas where whales can be left unperturbed, not bothered in the future. But the key thing is making people aware of the scale of the destruction that happened previously and ensuring to a greater or lesser degree that we never go back in that direction.
Thank you, Richard. That's a very, very important note. I wanted to ask the both of you now, when you're talking to people about the work that you're doing about biodiversity, what are some of the most common misconceptions that you've received or been asked about, and how do you usually respond to them?
I think one of the most common misconceptions, especially when you're working in biodiverse food systems, is that we're not able to feed the world while also keeping biodiversity in check. And that's completely not true. Majority of the farmers that are feeding all of us as is are smallholder farmers from the global south, from Africa. I mean, majority of them are already using regenerative methods. The problem is the large-scale industrial farms that hold up to 75% of commercialized land, and they're growing monocultures of corn, soy, canola, cotton. And of course you can't have a biodiverse system when Monsanto and Bayer and all these massive corporations are making a ton of money. And so it doesn't work in the same system. Can you have regenerative agriculture that feeds the world? Absolutely, and there's studies that point to that now more than ever. The United Nations has done studies showing the amount of food produced over an agroecology place in 11 years, produced more. It helped the farmers to rebuild local economies. It actually helped to mitigate local climate change effects in those areas, provided cooling. If we can farm in traditional ways and learn from the indigenous ways, because ultimately our teachers have to be those who are already with the land, we can farm in a naturalized way that actually benefits the environment and draws down carbon through regenerative agriculture and stores that carbon in our soil. And I saw somebody with a t-shirt around that said, nature's technology is actually able to be the only technology that helps our earth. And that's it. We keep moving towards artificial technology and artificial intelligence, and nature already has the intelligence to solve all of our problems. It's been telling us the solutions, and we've been ignoring it for decades. And the time is now that we start listening to those solutions and working with the world and working with nature and with the earth instead of so toughly pushing against it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I completely agree with you. There's this small farming community that I spend a lot of time with in the Philippines, and the land was originally owned by some landlord trying to convert it into a commercial area, and some parts of it were sugar cane monocrop plantations. But then what they did is that they slowly just started planting their stuff, and that is their form of resistance. They slowly took over the land by planting their stuff, and or automatically, without even talking to them about the environment or climate or biodiversity, it's the most biodiverse, and it's the one that's best for the land, because what you said was exactly right. The people who work with the land, it comes natural to them that land is life. When you work with the land so often and so deeply, you understand that you can't just put one kind of crop there because it's going to destroy the fertility of that area. And so we forget that. We forget that when we talk about biodiversity, so much of it is about food. So much of it is about access to land for small farmers. And as you said, across the world, it's mostly in the global south, and most of these small farmers, they don't have access to their own land. They don't own their land, and they're also some of the ones most killed for fighting against the land, fighting against the people who own the land, rather. So that there's several numbers by this organization called Global Witness that shows that land defenders are some of the most endangered environmental defenders and activists. And they don't even call themselves environmental defenders and activists. To them, it's natural to do it like this. And so we really need to ensure that when we talk about biodiversity and the protection of that, we really also stand in solidarity and find ways to fight for justice alongside the ones who are already doing this on a day-to-day basis. Richard, what are some of the misconceptions that you've seen, heard around the work that you're doing, or just, yeah?
I've heard you say this actually, Mitzi. It's about one of the problems is that we humans have taken ourselves out of nature. We think physically, we think we've kind of risen above it and we somehow control it. Absolutely not the case. We're part of biodiversity. We're part of that network of organisms across the planet that makes things happen. We all take from nature in different ways. This idea that biodiversity somehow isn't important or can somehow be, pushed to one side, and as you were saying, Rachel, going for monocultures and GM crops, and in my case, looking at the effects of things like fish farms, genetically modified salmon, the problems that causes, the issues that creates then with marine food webs, all of these things. The idea that biodiversity isn't what stabilizes things, isn't what continues to provide the things that we need as humans from nature. And with me, working with marine mammals, with whales and dolphins in particular, it's terms and words like resources, looking at or considering marine animals, whales, dolphins. The mic's gone.
Do you want to take this one?
Thank you very much. It's a bit weird that as soon as I started talking about fish farms.
Yes.
It's not conspiracy theories here, absolutely not. But the idea of these species, these animals as a resource, instead of considering them as organisms, as individuals in their own right, understanding, as I now do, because I work with not just fantastic collections, but also with incredible people from around the world, collaborating on projects, extracting information from field work, looking at what we have in our collections and combining the two and creating really powerful data sets, but understanding more and more that particularly with things like orcas, dolphins, communities of dolphins, there are individuals and families with distinct personalities. There's culture, there's learning, things that scientists didn't like to talk about, you know, in these terms 10 years ago. But now that's all been pushed to one side because it has to, because the evidence is there. It's implicit. We've already lost so much. We've already caused so much damage to the oceans. And it's almost, I mean, it's incredibly upsetting for me to think about the kind of damage that we have caused. But we need to understand it's not just about the abundance of a particular species, it's about the uniqueness of those smaller groups. It might be one group of orcas in one bay, in one part of the world, that has a particular kind of behavior, a particular kind of hunting technique, a particular kind of cultural adaptation. If we lose that, it's a criminal activity. So biodiversity, it's important to think about biodiversity, but it's also important to think about these organisms as more than just resources, more than just things that we can take from nature for our own benefit.
I'm gonna butcher this, and Erica's gonna be mad at me. But there's this fly scientist from the Natural History Museum, and she told us this story about how some bird, I don't remember which way, the American condor or something. It was, no, I'm wrong. Some bird. I'm so sorry to the biodiversity scientists. Was on the brink of extinction, and so conservationists at that time, they decided to try to have that, like, to get them back on track. And in the process of that, they killed off all the pests and the mites that are on that bird, and those pests and mites were only on that bird, and so they killed off an entire species of insects just because they didn't see the use of it, because it wasn't useful to people. But it is. But it also shouldn't be about being useful to people and individuals. It's about seeing how we are part of a larger ecosystem, and again, that removal of us from the ecosystem, pretending that we own everything, is how we've gotten to this crisis in the first place. I have one last question for you guys, then we're going to open the floor up to the audience if you have any questions for our wonderful panelists. And my last question is, what aspect of life makes you feel the most alive? Because essentially, nature is just life, and we forget that. So I wanted to ask you both, what aspect of life makes you feel the most alive?
It's a big question, and I feel like there's so much hope and joy and love in the earth and being connected to the earth. What makes me feel most alive is all of the intricacies that I don't even know about yet, how each microbe works with one another, how the wind moves the leaves, and how you see around you, if you're really present and if you're in this moment, the world around us is really a magical place, and it's all deeply interconnected, and everything serves an evolutionary purpose. And I don't understand it all, and none of us understand it all. And that's where it's scary when some people think they know it all and are willing to tamper with the functions of our planet. There is a purpose for everything, and that's what makes me feel alive, is knowing that I get to be a part of it in this lifetime and hopefully try to protect it to the best of my abilities, and understand that I will forever be a student of this earth.
Thank you. Richard?
I think it falls into two categories for me. It's very much relates to what you were saying, Rachel, about feeling privileged to be in this awful situation. And I know that sounds kind of counterproductive, but we're a community of people all trying to push things, work things, go in the same direction, to stop things, to bring education to, particularly to younger people, and to try and affect some kind of a change. And now is the time. Now is the time. This is the tipping point. I think everybody pretty much agrees that this is the tipping point. And in our lifetimes, we're going to see significant things happen, either for the good or for the bad. And thank goodness we have COP. And I know that people have mixed feelings about the efficacy of COP, but at least we have COP. We have that. But the other thing feeling alive, being very cold or being very hot, waking up first thing in the morning before anybody else is up, and going outside and being outside just as the sun comes up and hearing the birds, being in cold, snowy places, and just having nature push me to my limits and making me feel extreme things makes me feel incredibly alive. And probably the greatest one for me is being on a cliff by the sea on a super windy day, but not too close to the edge, and feeling the spray and the smell and everything. Just those sensorial things really make me feel alive.
Those are really good answers, and hearing them makes me feel alive. For me, it's I don't know if you guys see this a lot, but when the sun hits the ocean and it sparkles, how? Like, you know, like if you really think about it, the wonders that surround us in nature, it's mind-blowing. And I want us to keep having that mind-blowing nature. You know, that way we appreciate it more. We see how important it is. I'm also a big math nerd. Which I never tell people, but the Fibonacci sequence, or the golden spiral, it's present in every single thing in nature. And it's so fascinating to see how everything is really all just tied in together by this language that we made up as people to understand nature, right? It's basically us trying to grapple and understand nature. People think that physics and math and science is all like really boring numbers. It's like, if you look at it really, it's just people trying to interpret the world we're in. And we've forgotten that's where it all originally came from, and that we only did all this so that we can be with nature more. But now it's all about like profit, money, economics, you know? And so we need to go back to that. That's yeah, I'm feeling very energized. So do we have any questions from the audience? And if you want to direct it to a specific person, please let us know, and also introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a researcher from the UK. My question is, we're at the climate COP. You're talking about biodiversity. How do we go about bringing two separate COPs together? We have a climate COP, we have a biodiversity COP. We keep all the narratives, all the solutions, all the decision-making separate. But they're so intertwined. How do you bring that together?
Okay. I think that's a really funny thing, and I think so many different issues have been siloed almost purposely. When we look at COP, I hear a lot of talk about climate change and not always what causes climate change or what could be a solution. And biodiverse ecosystems are the greatest carbon sinks that we have. So if we're going to start talking about solutions to climate change, biodiversity has to be in the discussion, especially wetlands, grasslands, forests globally. Oceans are the greatest carbon sink, one of the greatest carbon sinks, and soil. And we can't have a conversation that's productive about climate change if biodiversity is not included. So I'm not sure how to bridge the two, but I think perhaps it's a discussion we need to start having more at COPs, to say we want biodiversity to be included in the discussion, in the solution, and in the decisions.
It's really hard for me to improve on that. I'll add to that.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm glad you went first. For me, I find it really, again, that word I keep using, counterintuitive, that it's not more intertwined, because they are so interlinked. They are, cause and effect. And I'd ask you the question, actually, as a researcher. I mean, you've asked a really great question. What do you think, I'm going to throw it back at you, what do you think should be done and could be done?
The only possible solution to bring them together that I can see is activism. I can't say, I'm perhaps cynical, but I see an awful lot of business interests on both sides. And in terms of actually looking at the biodiversity implications of lots of the climate solutions and looking both ways, I can't see a way where the two worlds would be allowed to come together. unless people say it needs to happen. They need to be looked at in conjunction.
So that, I suppose, takes us down the road of more awareness and a sort of a greater level of education and information, making sure that around the world, appropriately, given the cultural differences that exist, that the information is presented in the right way. And also, I think, and this might be a kind of bit of a tangent, one of the things that I've done at the museum over the past 5 or 6 years is I've started to work. I've been fortunate enough to build a community of artists and writers who work with me in the research collections that I study. Regularly, when I'm there, I invite them to be there too, because I feel that they should be as much a part of the study and the communication through their creativity as the work that we do as scientists at the museum. I think there needs to be a greater integration of arts and humanities into the conversation, and cultural recognition of the needs for communication across different cultures and how we get that information out there. And also in schools, it's still not being taught enough in schools. What is nature? You are a part of it, you know? So I think it's about...
When it comes to the COP biodiversity mixture, I was just thinking as well that agriculture was never on the agenda until a few years ago, and that has now made it to the agenda. So perhaps with enough demand, that ends up being the next topic.
Do we have more questions? There's a fly buzzing around, and it again reminds me of this thing that one of the scientists in NHM said, that if there's a fly in your room, there's a wild animal in your room. Framing it that way really just like blows my mind. Anyway, any more questions?
Hi, thank you so much for that discussion. So Mitzi, I have a question for you. And I have the privilege of knowing you a little bit already, so it's a bit of an informed question. But I mean, you're a climate justice activist, and for me, it's really, so I work for clarity, I work at the Natural History Museum as well with Richard, and so I'm completely in love with nature, 100% bought in. But there was a panel on climate justice earlier, and one of the young activists, Disha, the panel was asked about how they see the definition of climate justice, and Disha talked about our relationship with nature, which I didn't really see coming, because often when climate justice is discussed, I know it's multifaceted and complicated, but there tends to be a draw towards impacts on people, so people displacement, land rights, and so on, inequity of access to lots of things. And so it was interesting that she went straight to nature, and I just wanted to get your take on how you feel nature comes into that discussion around climate justice, because I haven't heard that as much as I've heard the kind of narrative around impacts on people specifically.
There's an indigenous leader from our country, and he didn't tell me his name for security reasons, but he says that climate change, or the climate crisis, happened when the colonizers came and started destroying the forests. When biodiversity was interrupted and went into imbalance, that's when climate change started and happened. And so climate justice is about bringing that biodiversity back into balance. And again, that means bringing people and our relationship back into nature. The climate crisis really started because we think that nature is a resource to use. Even our terms for it is a natural resources. But in Filipino, we say kayamanan, which is, it's not wealth, but that's how you translate it into it. It's not a resource. It's a, no, there's no word for it in English that I can think of, because again, that reflects how it is, right? But for us, it's like a thing that you treasure versus a thing that you use, a resource to take over, but something to take care of. And that's how you think of climate justice. That's how you really, like at its core, it's about getting rid of this system that only takes and takes and takes for the profit of a privileged few. And in that process, takes us all away from nature, takes us all away and puts in our minds that it's normal that you have fake grass, And it's normal that you don't see actual grass around you, or like that you don't have green spaces that are accessible to you. Because that's also how, like that's why there's so many malls, because it's good for profit. This country has so many malls. Anyway, people aren't given access to nature because if they're given access to nature, they fight for it. And when they fight for it, they're a threat to the status quo, they're a threat to the system. That's why land defenders, environmental defenders, ocean defenders who are in touch with nature are so threatened, because they are threatening the status quo and the powers that be. And so to restore a relationship with nature is revolutionary in the sense that we refuse to say that nature is something I use, but nature is something I am part of. And so I will protect it because she protects me. We have time for 2 to 3 more questions, so if you guys have some. Or reflections, thoughts, frustrations. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. One of the themes that comes up is a negativity around monetization of things. And I'm curious, or as well, about sometimes businesses' influence, and it's like indigenous people versus business, and there's a bit of a narrative around that. And I'm curious to hear anyone's thoughts on what does it look like for businesses to be allies rather than opponents and generally for, I mean, the word profit to me does sound very extractive, but for that quantification of value to become inclusive of all forms of value that includes nature. Yeah, quite a broad one, but keen to hear any thoughts.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I don't think anything has to be mutually exclusive. We live in a world where we need money, so businesses will exist, and that is the reality. I mean, if you're not working with a job or a company, life is tough. And so it's a matter of how business is done. I think when we're talking about businesses being really extractive by nature, a lot of it is because it's profits before people and the environment versus a system that is beneficial for people in those areas, a system that's beneficial for you as an individual, and a system that's beneficial for the environment. And I've worked with companies over the years that they provide active opportunities to folks who need opportunities while also benefiting the environment and creating fair trade systems. And rather than being extractive, it's the same idea of regeneration. With regenerative agriculture, I kind of use it as my metaphor. You're not extracting from the land, you're always giving back to it, and it's a circular system. The land will feed you, it will take care of you, as long as you feed the land and you take care of it. And same idea with businesses. There are models that can be done where profit is to be made, but it also does not negatively impact communities in such a way that it leaves them impoverished and leaves the land impoverished, and creates a classist system that unfortunately we have seen far too often.
Again, very difficult to add to that, but in the UK, you're probably aware, in the UK, one of the things that's been pushed through and is active is with developers, again, a loaded term, developers building. One of the things that has to be submitted as part of the application to take over the land and develop it, are we developing it for the better? We're just turning it into housing. What's being removed? They have to submit biodiversity benefits statements. So how is the development of the housing going to improve local biodiversity? And I only became aware of this explicitly maybe 6 weeks ago when a woodland just up the road from where I live in southeast London, it was made aware to the residents of the area that there's going to be an impact by the refurbishment of an old building. It's been turned into a care home, so that in and of itself has a benefit, obviously, to those who need that care. But there are lots of very well-established trees, native species, associated biodiversity. There's a certain amount of taking that has to happen for this development to go ahead. But as part of the application to the local authority, the plan discusses the planting and effectively the rewilding in some cases, and improvement, enhancement of biodiversity. I'd never come across that before. So I think my point is that there needs to be a greater awareness of the fact that, yes, we can and have to, as you say, we have to work with businesses. We have to. There's just no way not to. But let's have a greater awareness. Let's have a greater conversation. Let's have an understanding of what the impacts of the business that you're partnering with actually is. And of course, organisations like the Natural History Museum, we're a charity, but we also have due diligence whenever we enter into a corporate partnership with someone. We look into their background in fine detail because you have to be aware of just who it is you're partnering with. I don't think the two should be mutually exclusive. There's obviously benefits on both sides, but it's the nature of the modern world, isn't it? It's just the way it is. We can't be fighting with each other all the time, but we need to be aware of what the agendas are, let's say.
I just wanted to add as well that I think there's been a lot of youth advisory boards now and a lot of, or youth climate advisory boards for businesses, mostly for their foundations, sometimes for the actual business. But I think they should really elevate that and not just have young voices, but also scientists, that they're not employed by them, you know, because, and then I think that there needs to be real and honest conversations about how we can go about ensuring, again, as Rachel said earlier, prioritizing people and planet over profit. I've seen a lot of small businesses, and there's one in the US in Colorado, I think, named, I don't remember what they're called, but they're basically a farm that also does their shipping, that also does their food waste, and also their rubbish collection. And they're a collective, they're a collective of different businesses, and then because they're doing it all together and not one by one, and because they're trying to support each other in that way, in that community way, then they're all able to survive and also still profit, still, you know, as a business. I think those initiatives and those models are really cool and really need to be supported even more, because often those kinds of models are also the ones that are being threatened more by the government or by other multinational businesses that are bigger and larger, because again, it threatens their power. I think it's also really important that activists and advocates who have a more critical view on profit don't shy away from talking about it and talking to businesses, because then you end up with people who won't tell them what they really need to do. And so that's something that's also a challenge, because I know it's really difficult. I know you'd rather not talk to the people who don't see the importance of the planet, but sometimes you do need to have these hard conversations with them. And make sure also that tricky thing that you're not being greenwashed in the process or youth washed. But if you have like really real, genuine, almost like not broadcasted conversations, and that can be a start. Do we have more questions? Okay, and this will be our last question. Thank you.
What do you think about book bans?
Book bans?
Yeah, when they ban books, certain books.
I think that book bans are, I mean, regardless of where you are in the world, it's a problem. Freedom to information should always be at the key, and perhaps a little different than our topic here, but I think that ultimately we all deserve to have the right to know what is going on in the world. And if that's books, I mean, in Canada, I remember under previous leadership, they were banning actually scientists from coming forward on certain environmental topics, and that science was being hidden and actually burnt, which was pretty wild. And there's conversations around that to be had with what information is being hidden from the public.
I'm a great believer in freedom of speech and access to information. I don't agree with censorship. That's my personal opinion. It's not an institutional opinion, but nonetheless, you know, I don't know if it is a little bit kind of off topic for us, but is there a reason why you've asked us that question?
Yes, there is, because you're all storytellers, principals, climate activists, and kids' right to know. So when we think about all of those subjects it makes me think, okay, well, they're all teachers. What do they think about banning these books? Don't the kids, like she was saying, scientist books? And you look at what Hitler did. He burned a lot of books. There's a lot of information that we don't have now because of that. So that's why I was questioning it. And so thank you for answering it. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier in the beginning, where access to information is so crucial and important, and how even if you are in an educational system that's not banning books, a lot of the books that they need to be reading and information that they need to be reading aren't on the curriculum. So it might not be banned, but it's also not being provided and given, and there's no access to it still. And so it all goes back to that. If you do not know that there's something wrong, if you do not know that there's something you can do, then it's a lot harder for you to actually do something. But still recognizing that there's only so much that educational institutions can do, so it's a challenge for all of us to go outside of these educational institutions and go to the land, go to the people who are working on the land and learn from them, because there's so much to learn from that knowledge. And so that's so crucial and important. And if you look at and think of book bans, I might be wrong, I'm really bad at history, but wasn't there a time when they were burning the books because scientists said that the universe didn't revolve around the earth but around the sun? That's true, right? Like they burned books because of that. And so in every generation, again, they will silence the people who are trying to change the status quo, the people in power, etc. And so we have to keep pushing, and we have to keep using our voices to restore our relationship with nature. Thank you, everyone.